was going to talk about recycling society. This is a concept introduced by the European Union in its thematic strategy on waste and recycling. And just really asking the question, what might that actually mean in practice? What might that look like? How might we get there? Now, recycling society, you might initially think, oh, that's got to be about dutiful citizens all doing their bit, doing their recycling. We all do that, to a greater or lesser extent. My view, and I think the view or the vision of a recycling society goes way beyond that, and I'll talk a bit about how we can go beyond just people separating out waste. So I see it's about a fundamental shift in philosophy of waste and the processes that produce it, and ultimately the creation of value-added recycling loops. Now, as Maxine said, I found Beyond Waste, approaching 10 years ago now, to make an active contribution to this transformation from a waste to resource society or economy. So it's something that's quite close to my heart, this whole issue. How might it happen, or what drivers are there? Well, I think fairly simplistically, there's of course economics, which can be broken down into penalties in terms of fines or taxes, and we see landfill tax already having a very strong effect in terms of driving materials out of landfill, along with landfill allowance trading scheme, which is also similarly acting as a brake on landfill. Incentives-wise, recycling credits that local authorities may receive for what they recycle, and also discussions and some trials taking place about individual citizens receiving credits or rewards from their local authorities for the quantities that they recycle. On legislation, you've got push factors. What factors are actually working to push materials out of the low-cost disposal routes that have historically been relied on, particularly landfill, but also to some extent incineration. We have landfill bans. Now, one of the key pieces of legislation that has worked towards banning certain materials to landfill was the landfill directive adopted at the end of the last decade, and that's been progressively coming into effect, and we're seeing, first of all, movement of hazardous waste that was co-disposed in landfill out of landfill. We also see the Waste Incineration Directive, which introduced certain emission standards for incinerators and have, in a way, acted as a limit to what materials can go where when they're defined as waste. On the pull side, many EU directives have come through that have set targets for recycling of certain materials like packaging materials, end-of-life vehicles, waste electrical and electronic equipment, batteries. All of these are pulling materials out of the low-cost disposal routes into higher value uses. And last but not least, societal or political drivers, particularly around strategy targets that we've seen the UK government has adopted in its 2007 waste strategy, and then those have trickled down to regional strategies and also local strategies. And at a kind of company level, we see the corporate social responsibility initiatives of companies where, one, they're looking very clearly to reduce their costs. They're seeing the costs of disposal rising, but also we like to think that moving towards is kind of doing the right thing approach. So what might it look like? Well, there's a lot of talk about zero waste. There's various initiatives around the country. We have a pathway to zero waste in the southeast, which is Direct Taylor over there. That's talked about a lot. A lot of people say, what does that mean? Is that helpful? Does it create confusion? Interestingly enough, as a precursor to the debate this evening, all three political parties, or main political parties I should say, refer to zero waste in their manifestos. Conservatives want a goal of creating a zero waste society, the responsibility deal on waste. Labour are talking about a zero waste Britain with landfill bans in particular, and Liberal Democrats setting targets for zero waste, aiming to end the use of landfill. So it's becoming more and more a common term in the political parlance. I think as an industry, we need to get quite clear what we're talking about when we say that. Another term that I've come across recently was waste neutrality. Has anyone heard that one? This is one I happened to see actually down at the Eden project in Cornwall. I was there on holiday and wanted to check it out. That was a term they were using when they've reached a point where they're recycling an equivalent quantity of waste to that which they're producing. They've achieved waste neutrality. Quite an interesting concept, and that's something that perhaps would work at more of a organisational level than a national level. You could adopt a similar kind of thing to saying we should recycle as much paper, for example, in an office as we are actually using. So looking at your purchasing and checking to see what you're recycling. Now, in many offices, you send a lot of paper out of your office to other people as letters, etc. So it's a way of taking responsibility for that rather than passing on a problem. Value-added recycling, well, it's already happening in places, but it's hitting certain technical barriers as materials that are needing to be recycled are more complex. We're thinking here, for example, what's good, what's happening, glass bottles, those tend to get recycled back into glass bottles. They were being, we might call, downcycled into road aggregates, but we see some steps in the government now trying to look at looking at the embedded carbon in recycling processes to actually give recycling or closed-loop recycling of bottles to bottles a benefit or advantage over lower-grade recycling. But there are other materials like, for example, Tetra Paks that have plastic, aluminium and card all together that are the sort of item that, whilst maybe overall in the carbon footprint as a product or packaging use is beneficial because it avoids its lighter weighting, when it comes to actually trying to recycle that material, that's quite problematic. And at the moment, the recycling of that material that happens is actually, it's exported to Sweden where it's used in a paper mill, and where essentially the plastic and aluminium is then burnt to generate heat in the process. So not ideal, particularly when you think about what Mark said on peak oil and the limited availability of fossil fuels making plastic in particular. How will we know when we got there? One, we're looking at minimising resource input into production, as Mark was talking about, but also looking at the societal impacts. And there's a term often used called the ecological rucksack of production. This is one thing I like to think of maybe as an ecological rucksack. An item I actually picked up from the Eden project. Anyone hazard a guess as to what that's made out of? I won't put you on the spot here. It's actually made out of Virgin Atlantic seat covers from their planes, with the seat belts being made into a strap, and you've even got an inner tube there as a handle. I think that's quite a creative use of combination of materials to create something that actually will hopefully, well, I certainly intend to use it for a long time, will have durability and has an appeal beyond that of just putting the materials back into the recycling process. A book that is very useful on ecological footprint, or being aware of that, and the societal footprint is this one by Fred Pearce, Confessions of an Eco-Sinner. He goes back and anyone read that one? No? Okay. Preaching to the unconverted then. He goes back and traces various different products all the way through the origin of the materials, through to how they actually get made into, for example, cotton, into a shirt, and looks at issues that Mark raised, for example, around water use, but also societal impacts as well. And interestingly enough, he comes out with, on the Kenyan green beans idea, that of imports from Kenya, he says, looking at the whole social benefits of that, he plans to buy more green beans from Kenya rather than less. So I certainly recommend that as a book in terms of making you aware of you as a consumer, what the associated footprint of your purchasing is. So that's first thing, minimizing the resource impacts. Also developing true symbiosis. Now, I know we're going to have a conversation from NISP, the National Industrial Symbiosis Programme, but with byproduct utilisation, not simply, we've seen quite a number of initiatives through called industrial symbiosis that don't really capture the essence, I would say, of symbiosis, where it is a mutually beneficial relationship that is actually happening between two entities. That is what symbiosis is in nature, and that's what we should be ideally looking to recreate in our production activities. And of course, byproduct utilisation. Now, interestingly enough, I saw an article just the other day where they're now trying to breed sheep that don't have any wool. We were also doing some work looking at carbon footprinting of carpets, and particularly we're looking at wool carpets, and we're trying to understand, okay, does the carbon associated with the wool, should that be attributed to that carpet? And it seems that in fact wool is now just seen as a byproduct of meat or mutton production, and say some farmers are actually looking at trying to breed out wool because they say it's just not worth the hassle to actually shear. Now, you might say, well, that's good to be able to focus on one particular product, but historically we've had the benefit of various different byproducts coming through from our mainstream activities. In fact, here, a leather briefcase, well, you could say, well, leather is a byproduct of beef consumption. We're making good use of it. So, design for recycling, I wanted to just talk briefly about. We've got a concept called cradle to cradle, where we need to be looking at redefining products and their packaging to try to ensure that they are compatible and suitable for following what could in theory be perpetual recycling loops. That's what we want to create ideally. So again, one of my props. Got here a cardboard packaging for a sandwich with a plastic window on it. There's a lot of debate and discussion about the merits of bioplastics at the moment. I'd say if we're looking to try to ensure that food waste can go back through the recycling process effectively, and particularly there's a big drive to actually go towards anaerobic digestion, generate energy from it, put the digestate back onto land, so we're creating this recycling loop, then ideally I would suggest that we want to ensure that that window is made out of bioplastic. We want to ensure that rather than having to spend extra money depackaging food waste before it can go through an anaerobic digester, the packaging itself is suitable for digestion and can therefore be incorporated. So it's thinking that step ahead towards what the final fate of your product might be. Also on Cradle to Cradle, the book itself, very interesting concept. Anyone read it? Gosh, right, okay. Remaking the way we make things. They make a point, this book is not a tree. They've actually made this book out of plastic. Now you might say, what's the point of that? Well, you might say, well, if you're going to make a book out of, which has got some big ideas in that are durable and long-lasting, you should make it from a material that's equally durable and long-lasting. You can read this in the bath and you don't have to worry about it falling to pieces. Equally, the contention is that it's made with sufficiently pure polymer that when we've reached that nirvana of cradle to cradle and the idea has outlived its useful life, you can either pop it straight back into the polymer vat and manufacture something else out of it, or even, as they've developed, the inks could be washed off and it could be reprinted as another book. So people trying to push the boundaries of how we think about materials and products. And I'd say also on that front, in the cradle-to-cradle approach, they think about biological cycles. So that's where you would have materials that go straight back into composting, etc. And then technical cycles where you have materials that would then be recycled perpetually through the technical cycle. But what you want to try to avoid is mixing up the two, because that's when you have real problems that create headaches for us to actually achieve recycling society that we're looking to. And also, I'd say, just as an aside, useful to look at things like biomimicry, where we try to look at what nature does and how it produces products, and mimic how it does that. So an example, moving away from heat, beat and treat approaches, where, for example, we produce Kevlar, which involves very large amounts of energy to manufacture, also quite highly toxic materials, the sulfuric acid. You think about how a spider does it, well, do we know? But it doesn't involve heating, treating and beating. It actually does it in a very elegant way. So I think we have very big lessons to learn from how nature can actually produce the products that we may need. Buying better and buying behaviour, whether we need to move back towards a sort of thrift culture, and I think, I can still remember when people would talk about their cars or their TVs and they kept it running for so long, and that actually being a source of a degree of pride, when you talked about it, whereas of course now that would be probably treated with a degree of derision, where you sort of say, well, go and buy yourself a new one. That's where the kudos is. And I think we do need to try to break the link between this idea of either social status or happiness and frequent shopping. We need products for life, where we have a capability of repairing them, exchanging them, and more importantly, I'd say products that have an emotional durability. It's a term that's been coined by a professor in Brighton University. You're looking at products that actually may not only be functional, but also have a aesthetic appeal. Almost like the ideas that William Morris talked about, form and function. So I've got an example here. This is a product, kind of vase thing made from an old boiler, old hot water tank. They say, well, copper can easily be recycled back into hot water tanks to make that. But why not look at trying to create things that are quite beautiful? We don't have to solely be, in a thrift society. And something else that's a bit of we want recycled products as a norm, not a novelty. So you've all no doubt come across the pencil that was made from a CD case, for example. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if there's a number of stands around here that have that. Great idea in terms of raising awareness of recycling potential. But do you think about where that pencil ends up? Ends up as pencil shavings in the bin that then go to landfill, and the oil value of the plastic is actually lost forever. So I'd say, rather than going for novelty products like this, we need to go for things that are durable and that have a lasting effect. And the key thing around emotional durability is that they're also maybe adaptable. They change with you so that you appreciate them and they reflect where you're at on that time. Ultimately, when we've done all that, mining what remains of the remaining waste stream for those scarce resources is what's needed. Again, Mark referred to the resources that we're running out of, and an example, I think he cited gold. We know that for gold, I think it's about 1 troy ounce of gold. It takes about 10 tons of earth to shift, not to mention, I think it's the cyanide that's used to dissolve it out of the rock. So if we can actually think about the waste that remains as a source to actually mine and get the materials back into our society, that's when we might get to that stage of a recycling society. Thank you.